On the morning of our 5th wedding anniversary, at exactly 9:12 a.m., my husband wired $487,000 out of our joint account and didn't even bother to close the laptop before he walked out the door. I know the exact number because I was standing behind him holding a grocery list with 14 items on it when the confirmation screen flashed blue. He didn't turn around. He didn't explain. He just said, flat and calm, like he was commenting on the weather, "It's already done, Lila. Don't make this ugly." And then he left. If you've ever had a moment where your life split into a clean before and after, you know the strange quiet that follows. Not screaming, not crying, just silence so sharp it feels surgical. So before I tell you what happened next, I want you to do one thing. If you believe betrayal from family cuts deeper than betrayal from strangers, hit like right now. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if your spouse sold something that legally belonged to both of you without asking? Because I didn't scream. I didn't chase him. I did something much worse. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the county property records website. That's when I realized the transfer wasn't just money. He had sold the house. Our house. The house I had paid for. The house that still had my name on every mortgage payment for the last 4 years. The buyer's name sat there in black text on white background. Clara Whitmore, my husband's younger sister. And that was the moment something inside me went very still. Let me explain how we got there. My name is Lila Grace Bennett. I was 32 years old then, working as a licensed escrow officer in Phoenix, Arizona. My entire job revolved around protecting property transactions, verifying signatures, ensuring legal compliance, preventing exactly the kind of fraud I had just witnessed. Irony doesn't even begin to describe it. I met my husband, Daniel Whitmore, when I was 26. He was charming in a quiet, dependable way. He worked as a regional sales manager for a construction supply company and talked often about stability, building a future, wanting a family. And I believed him. Because unlike him, I had built everything alone. My mother died when I was 17. My father disappeared before that. By the time I turned 24, I'd worked 2 jobs, saved every bonus, and finally qualified for a first-time homeowner loan. I bought a modest 3-bedroom house in Mesa for $312,000. It was the first place that ever felt safe. When Daniel and I married 2 years later, I added him to the title after he insisted it was what real partnerships do. At the time, it felt romantic. Looking back, that was the first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating his family. Specifically, Clara Whitmore. Clara was 28, chronically unemployed, and perpetually in some kind of crisis. Medical bills, failed business ideas, broken leases, credit card debt. There was always something, and Daniel always stepped in. At first, it seemed like normal sibling loyalty. Then it started escalating. $3,000 here, $5,000 there. A co-signed car loan that he didn't tell me about until after. Each time I questioned it, he'd say the same thing. "She's family, Lila. She'd do the same for us." But Clara never did anything for anyone except take. And about 8 months before the day he wired that $487,000, something happened that I didn't fully understand at the time. Daniel began asking strange questions. Casual ones. Too casual. What happens if one spouse signs a sale agreement without the other present? Could a property transfer happen digitally? Does escrow always require both parties physically there? At the time, I answered him the way I answer clients every day. Factually, professionally, without suspicion. Because why would I suspect my own husband was studying how to steal from me? Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted. It was last Thanksgiving. Clara showed up to dinner with a designer handbag worth at least $4,000. She didn't have a job. She was 2 months behind on rent. And yet there she was, casually setting it on my dining table like it was nothing. When I asked where it came from, she smiled and said something I didn't understand until much later. Sometimes family invests in you. Daniel avoided eye contact the entire night, and that quiet avoidance that was the first crack in the foundation. But the real truth, it wasn't just about money. It never is. It was about something far more calculated. Because when I dug deeper into the property records that morning after he left, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The sale date listed wasn't that day. It was 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. Which meant, while we were sleeping in the same bed, eating dinner at the same table, celebrating birthdays and planning vacations, my husband had already sold our home behind my back. And here's the part that didn't make sense. Legally, that shouldn't have been possible. Not without my signature, not without my knowledge, not without me. So I sat there, staring at the screen, replaying every document I had signed in the last year, every email, every digital form, every authorization request. And then I remembered something small, something I had dismissed at the time. 2 months earlier, Daniel had asked me to sign what he called a refinancing pre-authorization packet. Just routine paperwork, he said. Nothing urgent. Just needed my electronic signature. I signed it without reading carefully because I trusted him, because he was my husband, because I had no idea I was signing the first piece of evidence in a betrayal that was far bigger than a stolen house. And as I sat there at that kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen, my phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. You should stop looking into the house before you ruin your husband's life. No name, no explanation. Just that. And in that moment, I realized something even more chilling than the theft itself. This wasn't a desperate mistake. It was planned, carefully, systematically. And I wasn't the only person who knew about it. At 7:38 p.m. that same night, I sat in my car across the street from my own house, technically no longer mine, counting the seconds between the porch light turning on and off, like it was some kind of signal. It flicked 3 times, pause, then stayed on. That was the moment I saw Clara Whitmore step out onto the front porch, carrying a glass of red wine, wearing my robe, the soft gray one I bought for $89.99 during a winter sale at Nordstrom 3 years earlier. She wasn't supposed to have a key. She wasn't supposed to be there at all. But she looked completely at home. And that was when I realized something that felt colder than anger. This hadn't just been a financial betrayal. They had already started replacing me. Before I go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone calmly step into a life that used to be yours? Like they were trying on a jacket? Tell me honestly in the comments, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and gather proof first? Because that night, every instinct in my body screamed to walk across the street, unlock the door, and demand answers. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, hands steady, breathing slow. Because I knew something they didn't. I understood the law. And the law, when used correctly, is quieter and far more devastating than any confrontation. I pulled out my laptop and logged into the Maricopa County Recorder database again. I needed to see the actual documents. The deed transfer file took 42 seconds to load. 42 seconds of silence, so thick I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then the scanned image appeared. Grant deed transfer. Seller, Daniel Whitmore and Lila Bennett Whitmore. Buyer, Clara Marie Whitmore. Purchase price listed, $410,000. That number alone told me something was wrong. The house had appraised for $615,000 just 6 months earlier. He hadn't just sold it behind my back. He had sold it at a massive undervalue, which legally meant only one thing. It wasn't a normal sale. It was a non-arm's-length transaction. A transfer between related parties, often used to hide assets, or move money discreetly, or avoid scrutiny. My chest felt hollow as I scrolled to the signature page. There it was, my name. My electronic signature, timestamped 2 months ago. Exactly the same day Daniel had handed me that so-called refinancing packet. My hands didn't shake. That part surprises people when I tell them this story. They expect tears, panic, breakdown. But what I felt wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Because the moment I saw that signature, I knew something Daniel didn't realize. I knew exactly how to prove it wasn't valid. See, in Arizona, a property transfer involving married co-owners requires more than just digital consent. It requires a notarized verification process, identity confirmation through a licensed escrow or title officer. And I had never sat in front of a notary for that sale, which meant one of 2 things had happened. Either he had forged my identity, or someone inside the system had helped him bypass the process. Both were crimes, felony-level crimes. And suddenly, this wasn't just a divorce issue. It was fraud, serious fraud. But before I could even process that realization fully, something unexpected happened. The front door of the house opened again. Daniel stepped outside. He looked relaxed, not nervous, not guilty, just comfortable. Like a man who believed everything was already settled. Clara handed him a drink, and they laughed about something I couldn't hear. Then he said a sentence that I'll never forget, because I saw his lips clearly through the windshield. She doesn't know yet. And even if she finds out, it's too late. Too late. That phrase echoed in my head. Because Daniel had always underestimated one thing about me. I never react immediately. I observe, I calculate, I wait, and then I act once. Precisely, like closing a trap. So instead of driving over there, I opened my email and searched for the refinancing packet he had sent months earlier. It took only a minute to find. Subject line: urgent. Loan pre-approval authorization. At first glance, it looked like standard lender paperwork, but once I downloaded the PDF and zoomed in on the metadata, my breath caught. Because the document wasn't created by any bank. The file author name listed CW Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of it, but I knew what it meant. It wasn't a financial institution. It was a private entity, a shell company. And when I ran a quick business registry search, the ownership records popped up instantly. Registered owner, Clara Marie Whitmore. That was when the final piece of that night clicked into place. This hadn't been a last-minute desperate act. They hadn't just sold my house. They had created a company, designed fake loan paperwork, used my digital signature to authorize it, then transferred my property into that company's control, step by step, layer by layer, clean, quiet, professional, too professional, which meant something else was true. They hadn't figured this out on their own. Someone with legal or escrow knowledge had guided them, and that realization sent a slow chill down my spine, because suddenly, the betrayal was bigger than Daniel, bigger than Clara. It meant someone in my own industry, possibly someone I knew, had helped orchestrate the theft of my home. Just as that thought settled in, my phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. Another message appeared. You're very smart, Lila. Smart people know when to walk away. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. I typed only 4 words. Who else is involved? The reply came instantly. 3 words. Ask your office. And in that moment, sitting in the dark, across the street from a house that no longer legally belonged to me, I realized something far more dangerous than betrayal. This wasn't just a family scheme. It was connected to my workplace, which meant the person who helped steal my home was someone I might see every single day. 3 days later, at 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, I walked into my office in downtown Phoenix with a $12 latte in one hand and a felony suspicion in the other. I had slept exactly 4 hours over the past 72, not because I was spiraling, because I was reconstructing every transaction file, every internal login, every digital signature audit trail I could legally access without triggering alerts. And the more I reviewed, the more something became clear. This wasn't a random inside assist. It was deliberate, calculated, and it had passed through one specific authorization channel. Before I tell you what I found, let me ask you something. If you discovered someone at your job might be helping your spouse steal from you, would you confront them immediately? Or would you pretend everything was normal? Because I smiled at everyone that morning. I said, "Good morning." I complimented someone's haircut. I even attended the 9 a.m. compliance briefing like nothing was wrong. That's the advantage of being underestimated. No one suspects the quiet one. My office handles mid-size residential escrows, properties between $250,000 and $800,000. We close about 40 files a month. Every document is digitally logged. Every notary verification has an internal tracking number. And here's what Daniel didn't know. I still had access to system audit logs, not the ones that show up in the client portal. The back-end logs, the ones that record IP addresses, device fingerprints, timestamps down to the millisecond. So I pulled up the transaction tied to the deed transfer. File number 23-7719-CW. CW, Clara Whitmore. Subtle, except not subtle enough. The initiating IP address wasn't from a lender's office. It wasn't from Clara's apartment. It wasn't even from Daniel's work. It was from inside my building, specifically Terminal 4B. There are 26 terminals in our office. Only one person uses 4B. Her name is Monica Reyes, senior escrow processor, 41 years old, 10 years at the company, and someone I once considered a friend. Monica had trained me when I first started. She was sharp, efficient, detail-obsessed, the kind of woman who never made careless mistakes, which meant this wasn't a mistake. I felt something unfamiliar then. Not panic, not even rage. It was disappointment, layered and heavy, because Monica had been at my wedding. She had toasted Daniel. She had hugged Clara. She knew exactly what that house meant to me, and yet her credentials had been used to bypass the notarization step, which only happens under one condition: manager override. There are only 2 people in our office with that authority: Monica and our branch director, Thomas Keegan. But Thomas doesn't touch individual files unless there's litigation involved. Monica does. My heart beat slow and steady as I reviewed the digital trail. The system showed my electronic signature verified through remote identity confirmation. Except I had never submitted remote identity confirmation, ever. That process requires a recorded video call with a licensed notary, which means somewhere there was either a fabricated video or someone impersonated me. That's federal wire fraud. Up to 20 years. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to feel it. Not fear, resolve. Because here's something Daniel never understood about me. I don't destroy when I'm angry. I dismantle when I'm calm. At 11:32 a.m., I walked into Monica's office, holding a printed copy of the transaction summary. She looked up and smiled. "Hey, Lila. You look tired." "I am," I said evenly. "Quick question. Did you process file 23-7719-CW? She didn't hesitate. "Doesn't ring a bell. Why?" "Lie." She didn't even glance at the page. Experienced processors always glance. Always. I set the paper on her desk. "It's a property transfer in Mesa, closed 3 weeks ago." Her eyes flickered just for half a second. There it was. Recognition. Then she recovered. "Oh, that one. Yeah, I remember. Straightforward family transfer." "Family transfer?" I repeated softly. "Yes. Husband and wife selling to sister. Clean file. All digital. Clean." That word again. I nodded slowly. "And you verified the wife's identity remotely?" "Of course." "How?" She leaned back. "Standard video confirmation." "Why?" "Because there was no video on record. Because the server log showed a file upload without corresponding storage. Because the identity check code had been manually overridden." But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, I asked one more question. "Did you know the wife personally?" That one made her pause. A longer pause. "Why would that matter?" "Because I am the wife." But I didn't tell her. I just watched her. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. She wasn't nervous. She was confident, which meant she believed she was protected. By whom? Daniel? Clara? Or someone higher? That afternoon, I requested access to archive server backups under the pretense of preparing for our annual compliance audit. No one questioned it. That's the beauty of reputation. I've never given them a reason to doubt me. By 6:40 p.m., after everyone had left, I found it. A deleted file. Recovered from backup. A 14-minute video labeled remote_verification_lb.mp4. Timestamped the same day as the electronic signature. My pulse slowed as I opened it. The screen loaded. And there she was. A woman sitting in front of a blank wall. Blonde hair pulled back, wearing glasses, holding up a driver's license. My driver's license. Except it wasn't me. It was someone who looked just close enough to pass in low resolution. Same hair color, similar face shape, different eyes, different jawline. Clear, deliberate. And then I heard Monica's voice on the recording. "Please confirm your full legal name for the record." The woman replied, "Lila Grace Bennett Whitmore." Perfect. And in that moment, I understood something far deeper than fraud. This wasn't just about helping Daniel move money. This required coordination, fake ID access, a paid impersonator, which means money had changed hands long before that $487,000 transfer. I sat there in the dim office light, watching the rest of the video. At minute 12, Monica says something that made my stomach tighten. As discussed with Daniel, this needs to be completed before the end of the quarter. As discussed with Daniel. So they had spoken directly, which meant this wasn't Clara manipulating him. Daniel had orchestrated it, fully aware, fully involved, and suddenly, the betrayal shifted shape. It wasn't a weak husband pressured by his sister. It was a man who studied the system his wife worked in and weaponized it against her. I closed the laptop slowly. Outside the office window, the city lights flickered on one by one. Phoenix looked calm, ordinary, like nothing criminal had just unraveled inside a quiet escrow firm. But something else bothered me, something subtle. Why would Monica risk her career for Daniel? For Clara? She had nothing to gain, unless she was promised something, or threatened, or both. As I packed my bag, my phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. One final message that night. You're digging in the wrong direction. Monica isn't the one you should be worried about. I stared at the words, because if Monica wasn't the real threat, then who was? 2 weeks after the house was sold, at exactly 3:04 p.m. on a Friday, Daniel filed for divorce and requested temporary exclusive use of the property I no longer legally owned. He was asking the court to grant him possession of the house he had already transferred to his sister. The filing fee was $435. The audacity was priceless. I found out because I was served at work. A uniformed process server walked into the lobby while I was reviewing a $728,000 commercial refinance file and asked for Lila Grace Bennett Whitmore. Everyone heard. Everyone looked. I took the envelope with steady hands. Thank you, I said calmly, and then I went back to my desk and opened it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Grounds: irreconcilable differences. Attached was a request for asset division. He listed the Mesa property as marital asset currently occupied by petitioner. He didn't mention that it had already been transferred. He didn't mention the $487,000 wire. He didn't mention Clara. And that's when I understood the second layer of this betrayal. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was building a narrative. Before I continue, let me ask you something. When someone moves first in a legal fight, do you think that makes them stronger or just louder? Because Daniel was trying to get ahead of something, and that meant he knew I was close. The divorce filing wasn't emotional. It was strategic. In Arizona, a community property state, assets acquired during marriage are divided 50-50. But if he could argue that the house had been legally sold before separation, then the proceeds would be considered liquidated marital funds, which he could then claim were used for family assistance, meaning Clara, meaning that money might be gone before a judge ever looked at it, unless I moved carefully. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I called an attorney. Her name is Marissa Caldwell, 39 years old, Harvard Law, specializes in complex asset concealment and high-conflict divorces. I had referred clients to her before. Now I was sitting across from her in a glass conference room at 6:15 p.m., placing printed screenshots of my own stolen life on the table. She listened without interrupting. No gasps. No exaggerated sympathy. Just focused attention. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you want the house back? Or do you want him exposed? I didn't hesitate. Both. She nodded once. Then we don't confront. We collect. Marissa explained something Daniel clearly didn't account for. Even if a deed is recorded, a transfer can be voided if obtained through fraud, forgery, or misrepresentation, especially if identity impersonation is involved. And impersonation across state-regulated notary systems? That triggers federal investigation. Layer 3. Legal consequences. But she cautioned me, if we accuse too early, they'll destroy evidence. So we needed proof airtight enough that even denial wouldn't matter. Because here's how people like Daniel react when cornered. First, they deny. Then, they blame. Then, they claim victimhood. And finally, they collapse. But only if the evidence is undeniable. That night, Marissa filed a motion for financial preservation. It froze any large transfers connected to the marital estate, including accounts Daniel didn't know I had visibility into. Because here's something he forgot. He used our joint account to wire the $487,000, which means bank logs exist, timestamps, IP addresses, device IDs, and the bank's fraud department doesn't like being bypassed, especially not for nearly $500,000. But just as we began pulling financial subpoenas, something else surfaced. The impersonation video. Marissa watched it twice. Then she leaned back. This isn't just fraud. This is organized. She pointed at the screen. The woman in that video? She's done this before. How do you know? The way she holds the ID. The way she answers without hesitation. That's practiced. Which meant Clara and Daniel hadn't just improvised. They hired someone. And hiring someone means payment. And payment leaves trails. The next morning, I received an email from Daniel. Subject line: "Let's keep this civil." Inside was a calm, almost patronizing message. "Lila, I know you're upset, but this is the cleanest way to separate. Clara needed stability. The house is safer with her. We can divide remaining assets fairly. Safer with her." I read that sentence 3 times. The house I purchased before I even met him. The mortgage I paid 62% of over 4 years. Safer with her. And then came the subtle threat. If you try to make this criminal, it will damage both of us professionally. Both of us. There it was. He was counting on my reputation, counting on my fear of scandal, counting on my silence. And for a brief moment, I felt the weight of that. Because in my industry, even being associated with fraud can stain your name, even if you're the victim. And I wondered, would you risk your career to expose your spouse? Or would you take a quiet settlement and walk away? That question sat heavy in my chest. Until something unexpected happened. At 2:47 p.m., Monica walked into my office, closed the door, and said, very quietly, "You need to stop digging." Her voice wasn't threatening, it was shaken. I didn't respond. She continued, "You don't understand who else is involved. Then explain it to me," I said calmly. She looked at the floor, then back at me. This wasn't my idea. I was told to process it. By who? Silence. Her hands were trembling, and that's when I saw it. Fear. Real fear. Not guilt. Not arrogance. Fear. Which means she wasn't protecting Daniel. She was protecting someone else. And just before she left my office, she said one sentence that changed everything. "If this goes public, it won't just be your marriage that collapses." Then she walked out, and I realized something far more dangerous than losing my house. This wasn't just about family betrayal anymore. It was about something inside my company. Something big enough that even Monica was afraid to say the name out loud. And for the first time since this started, I wondered if I was walking into something far larger than I had planned for. At 6:02 a.m. the next morning, I found a sealed envelope taped to my apartment door with exactly one number written on the front in black marker. 4B. Monica's terminal number. Inside was a single printed bank statement showing a wire transfer of $75,000 sent 3 months earlier from an account I didn't recognize. The recipient name made my throat go dry. Monica Reyes, and the sender, Whitmore Holdings Trust. Not Clara's LLC, not Daniel's personal account. A trust, which meant lawyers, which meant planning that went far deeper than a simple property grab. I stood in that hallway for a long time staring at the paper. Because that amount, $75,000, isn't random. It's large enough to change someone's life, but small enough to look like a consulting payment, or a bonus, or a loan. It's what you pay when you want someone's cooperation without triggering automatic bank scrutiny. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If someone paid your coworker tens of thousands of dollars to help your spouse betray you, would you confront the coworker first, or follow the money trail quietly? Because by then, I understood something clearly. Confrontation gives people time to lie. Evidence takes that time away. So I didn't call Monica. I didn't call Daniel. I called Marissa Caldwell. She met me at her office at 7:45 a.m., still holding a coffee she hadn't touched. She reviewed the statement once, then twice. Her expression changed. This just escalated. How? Because a trust doesn't exist without a trustee. and trustees leave paper trails. She tapped the sender name again. Whitmore Holdings Trust wasn't created for Clara. It was created to protect assets. Daniel's assets? She shook her head slowly. Number. Something bigger. That word hung in the air. Bigger. And suddenly, pieces from the past started connecting in ways I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Daniel had never been particularly wealthy. Comfortable, yes, but not trust fund level. Not wire $75,000 without flinching level, which meant the trust wasn't built from his income. It was inherited or controlled by someone else. And there was only one person left in the Whitmore family with that kind of money. Margaret Whitmore, Daniel's mother. Margaret was a quiet, polished woman in her late 60s who owned several commercial properties across Arizona and Nevada. She rarely spoke at family gatherings, but when she did, people listened because she controlled the money. And more importantly, she controlled Daniel. Suddenly, everything Monica said made sense. This wasn't my idea. I was told to process it. She hadn't been afraid of Daniel. She had been afraid of Margaret. Marissa exhaled slowly. If the trust paid Monica, then your mother-in-law isn't just aware. She orchestrated it, I finished quietly. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to disbelief. Because Margaret had always been polite to me. Distant, but polite. She sent Christmas cards, wrote checks for birthdays, called me dear. And now it appeared she had funded the theft of my home. But why? Why would she care enough to plan something this complex? Marissa answered that question before I even voiced it. Inheritance control. She explained it simply. Margaret's wealth was tied to family holdings. If Daniel divorced me without securing major assets first, I could potentially claim spousal rights to future distributions. But if he transferred property into a family-controlled trust before separation, then legally, those assets could be shielded, which meant this wasn't about helping Clara. Clara was just the front. The real goal was protecting Whitmore family wealth from me. The house was collateral damage, a strategic sacrifice. And suddenly, the betrayal cut deeper than I expected, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated financial exclusion. A quiet message. You will never belong to this family, and we will make sure you leave with nothing. Marissa leaned forward. Here's the important part. This trust payment proves conspiracy. She outlined what that meant legally. If we could show Margaret funded Monica, and Monica facilitated identity fraud, and Daniel knowingly used that fraud to transfer property, then we wouldn't just have a civil case. We would have criminal exposure from multiple parties. Federal wire fraud, conspiracy, forgery, the kind of charges that don't settle quietly. And that's when a strange calm settled over me. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting, I was positioning. But before we could move forward, something unexpected happened. At 10:11 a.m., Daniel called. He hadn't called once since filing for divorce. His voice sounded calm, almost gentle. Lila, I heard you've been asking questions at work. I didn't respond. He continued. You're going to ruin your career chasing this. There it was again. The assumption that fear would stop me. I spoke evenly. You sold our house. Silence. Then he sighed. It wasn't your house anymore. A small, cold sentence. And one that revealed more than he intended. Because it meant he had mentally erased my ownership long before the paperwork. I asked quietly, did your mother tell you to do it? Another pause, longer this time. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. You don't understand how this family works. Not a denial, not a yes, just a warning, which told me everything. Because in that moment, I realized the third layer of betrayal. Daniel hadn't just chosen his family over me. He had been trained to, conditioned to, and I was never meant to win against them. But he underestimated one thing. I don't fight emotionally. I fight methodically. And while he believed the house transfer had closed the story, it had actually opened the investigation. That afternoon, Marissa filed a formal notice requesting full disclosure of Whitmore Holdings Trust records, a move that would legally force Margaret to respond. But just before the paperwork was submitted, Monica sent me a message. One sentence. If you subpoena the trust, they will come after you personally. I stared at the screen because she didn't say Daniel. She didn't say Clara. She said they, which meant there were still players in this story whose names I hadn't even discovered yet. At exactly 9:27 p.m. that night, a black SUV with tinted windows parked across from my apartment and idled there for 42 minutes without turning off its headlights. I know the exact time because I recorded it. 3 separate clips from 3 different angles. That's what you do when you work in escrow long enough. You learn that proof isn't something you gather once. You gather it redundantly. By the time the SUV finally drove away, one thing was very clear. Someone wanted me to feel watched, not harmed, not confronted, just reminded. And that distinction matters, because intimidation without direct contact is designed to do one thing: make you stop voluntarily. Before I go on, let me ask you something. If you believed powerful people were quietly warning you to back off, would that make you more cautious or more determined? Because I didn't call the police. I didn't post online. I didn't tell friends. I opened a new digital folder labeled Pressure Tactics, and I added the footage inside. Because intimidation isn't illegal unless you can prove intent. And proving intent requires patterns. That same night, Marissa called me. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge I hadn't heard before. The trust records request triggered a response. That fast? I asked. Yes, she said quietly, which means they were expecting it. That sentence landed heavily, because it meant Margaret and whoever else was involved weren't reacting blindly. They had contingency plans, prepared strategies, legal teams ready to move. Marissa continued. The Whitmore Holdings Trust filed a motion this afternoon to seal financial disclosures. To seal them? I repeated. Yes. They're claiming the records involve multi-state commercial partnerships unrelated to your divorce, which meant they were trying to keep everything out of public court filings. That's what wealthy families do when they don't want scrutiny. They don't deny, they bury. But Marissa didn't sound discouraged. They can delay disclosure, she said, but they can't stop a criminal investigation. And that's when we crossed into territory I hadn't fully processed until that moment. Because up to now, everything had been civil. Property disputes, divorce proceedings, financial preservation. But impersonation across a notarized system, that's criminal. Federal jurisdiction. And the moment that happens, private wealth stops being a shield. It becomes a spotlight. Marissa spoke carefully. If we push forward, this becomes public record. Your name will be tied to it. Your company will be questioned. I understand. Do you? Her tone softened. This won't just affect Daniel. It will affect your entire professional reputation. And for the first time since this began, I felt the weight of that truth. Because escrow is a trust-based industry. Clients hand us life-changing sums of money. If your name becomes associated with fraud, even as a victim, it can follow you forever. I sat in silence for a long moment, and then I said something that surprised even me. They already tried to erase me quietly. I'm not going to help them finish the job. Marissa exhaled slowly. Then we proceed. The next step was strategic. Instead of immediately filing a criminal complaint, we prepared a demand letter. Not to Daniel, not to Clara, to the Whitmore Holdings Trust itself. It outlined the evidence we had: unauthorized property transfer, impersonation in notary verification, financial payment to a third party, conspiracy to conceal marital assets. And it gave them exactly 7 business days to respond before we filed a formal criminal referral. 7 days. That number wasn't random. It creates urgency without panic. Enough time for them to calculate. Not enough time to erase evidence. Because digital trails don't disappear instantly. They fade. And while they fade, they leave shadows. But something unexpected happened the very next morning. At 10:03 a.m., Monica called me. She had never called me outside work before. Her voice was tight. You need to listen carefully. I didn't speak. She continued, the person you think is running this isn't the one making the final decisions. Then who is? Silence. Long enough that I thought the call dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The trust doesn't belong to Margaret. My heart slowed. Because if the trust didn't belong to Daniel's mother, then everything I believed about the power structure was wrong. Who controls it? I asked. Another pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. It belongs to the Whitmore Family Partnership Board. Board? I repeated. Yes. 3 members. Margaret Whitmore, a financial attorney named Charles Benton, and she stopped mid-sentence. Monica, I said evenly. Who's the third member? Her breathing sounded uneven now, because whatever she was about to say scared her more than anything she'd revealed so far. Finally, she whispered one name. Your branch director, Thomas Keegan, the man who signed my performance reviews. The man who approved every high-level transaction in our office. The man who had known me professionally for 6 years. And suddenly, everything shifted. Because this wasn't just a family betrayal. It wasn't even just corporate corruption. It meant someone with authority inside my own workplace. Someone who had direct control over transaction overrides. Was part of the same financial network that benefited from stealing my house. Which explained something that hadn't made sense until now. Why Monica wasn't the real threat. Why she was afraid. Why she kept saying she was told what to do. Because she wasn't protecting Daniel. She was protecting the man who controlled her career. And possibly her future. Before I could respond, Monica said one last sentence. If this goes public, Thomas won't just lose his job. He'll destroy everyone connected to him before he falls. Then the call ended. I sat there staring at my phone for a long time, because that changed the scale of the battle completely. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. It wasn't just a fraud case. It was a power structure, family money, corporate authority, legal networks, all intertwined, and I was standing right in the middle of it. But what unsettled me most wasn't fear. It was a question that suddenly had no clear answer. If Thomas Keegan was on the trust board, then how long had he known about me? About my marriage? About my house? And had he been watching me long before I ever realized I needed to watch him back? 4 weeks after Daniel wired $487,000 out of our joint account, I stopped asking questions. Not publicly, not at work, not through attorneys. At 8 a.m. on Monday, I walked into the office wearing the same neutral expression I had perfected over years of closing 6-figure transactions. I brought donuts. I laughed at a joke about interest rates. I complimented Thomas Keegan on a new tie. And I said nothing about the trust. Nothing about the impersonation video. Nothing about the $75,000 wire. Silence can be louder than accusation. And I wanted them to hear it. If you've ever dealt with manipulative people, you know this. They prepare for anger. They prepare for confrontation. They do not prepare for stillness. Thomas watched me that week. Not obviously, but I noticed the glances through the glass of his corner office, the way his assistant lingered near my desk, the way Monica avoided eye contact but looked relieved, because my silence told them one thing. Either I had backed down or I was building something. They just didn't know which. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. That Friday, Thomas called me into his office at exactly 4:17 p.m. End of day. Strategic timing. He closed the door gently. Lila, he began, folding his hands on the desk. I've heard there's some personal stress affecting you. His tone was calm, concerned, almost paternal. I didn't react. He continued. Divorce is difficult, and when personal matters overlap with professional environments, it can create complications. There it was. The first move, framing it as emotional instability. I'm managing, I said evenly. He nodded. I just want to ensure that no misunderstandings turn into legal distractions for the company. Not for you. For the company. That was deliberate, because corporations protect themselves first. I held his gaze. Are there misunderstandings I should know about? For a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, his jaw tightened. Then he smiled. Number. Just making sure we're aligned. Aligned. Interesting word. Because alignment implies shared interests. And mine were no longer aligned with his. When I left his office, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt confirmed. He was nervous enough to probe, but not nervous enough to panic, which meant he believed the trust's legal shield would hold. And that told me something critical. The trust was their confidence. So that's where we would break them, but not yet. First, I needed insulation. Marissa and I made a decision that week. We would separate my professional identity from the investigation. Quietly, legally, strategically. I updated my resume. Reached out to 3 competing escrow firms in Scottsdale and Tempe. Scheduled informational meetings, not interviews. Conversations. Because if this exploded publicly, I needed options. And then something unexpected happened. One of those firms, Desert Crest Title Group, offered me a position. Higher salary. Independent authority. Direct reporting line to corporate, not a local branch director. The offer came in writing within 72 hours. Thomas didn't know. Daniel didn't know. Margaret didn't know. But for the first time since this started, I wasn't standing inside their structure anymore. I was building my exit. And exits change power dynamics. That same week, Marissa received a response from the Whitmore Holdings Trust. Not a denial, not an apology, a settlement proposal. They offered $220,000. No admission of wrongdoing. Non-disclosure agreement required. Immediate withdrawal of all claims. $220,000. Less than half the wire. Less than half the house value. It wasn't compensation. It was hush money. Before I tell you what I did, let me ask you something. If someone offered you $250,000 to stay silent, would you take it? Or would you risk losing everything to expose the truth? Because I won't lie. For a brief moment, I considered it. Take the money, walk away. Start fresh. No scandal. No court. No headlines. But then I remembered Daniel's words. It wasn't your house anymore. And something inside me hardened permanently. I told Marissa to reject the offer, in writing, without counterproposal. Just one sentence. My client declines. Silence again. Then, 3 days later, escalation. Daniel filed an emergency motion, claiming I had illegally accessed proprietary escrow data and was threatening to damage his family's business interests. It was clever. Frame me as unstable. Frame me as vindictive. Make it look like I was misusing company resources, which would justify Thomas suspending me, which would isolate me, which would weaken my credibility. Except Daniel made one mistake. He assumed I had accessed files improperly. I hadn't. Every record I pulled was within compliance audit authority. Every backup retrieval logged correctly. I knew the rules better than he did, and I had followed them precisely. Because revenge isn't rage. Revenge is preparation. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, Monica walked into my office again, but this time she closed the door and locked it. She looked exhausted. They're planning to terminate you, she said quietly. On what grounds? Ethics review. They're claiming conflict of interest. Of course they were. Remove me from the company. Discredit me. Then paint any accusations as retaliation from a fired employee. Classic containment strategy. But Monica didn't stop there. Her voice trembled slightly. There's a board meeting next month. Annual partnership review. Investors will be present. And Thomas doesn't want any instability before that meeting. That detail mattered, because public investor meetings are controlled environments, prepared presentations, carefully curated narratives, reputation sensitive. And suddenly, something aligned in my mind. The board meeting wasn't just an obstacle. It was an opportunity. Public setting. Decision makers present. Documentation available. Witnesses. And most importantly, a stage they didn't expect me to use. I looked at Monica carefully. Why are you telling me this? She swallowed. Because I didn't sign up for criminal charges. That was the first time she said it out loud. Criminal. She was afraid now. Not of Thomas, not of Margaret, of prison. And fear makes people cooperative. Before she left, she said one more thing. If you're going to move, do it before the board meeting. After that, they'll close ranks. I nodded slowly, because she was right. Power protects itself after public validation. But during public presentation, it's vulnerable. And that night, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened a new folder on my laptop. I named it Board Day. Because I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to wait quietly. And when the room was full, I was going to speak once and let the evidence speak louder than I ever could. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. Silence was just the sound of me sharpening the blade. 10 days before the annual partnership board meeting, at exactly 6:41 a.m., I walked into a notary office on Camelback Road, carrying a sealed envelope that weighed less than 2 ounces, but could destroy 3 people's lives. Inside were 6 documents, certified copies, time-stamped, legally authenticated, each one selected for a single purpose, not to accuse, to prove. Because by then, I understood something most people never learn about revenge. It isn't about emotion. It's about timing. And timing is everything. Before I tell you what those documents were, let me ask you something. If you had evidence powerful enough to ruin someone publicly, would you reveal it immediately? Or would you wait for the exact moment when they couldn't control the narrative? Because I didn't rush. I spent those 10 days doing something far more dangerous. I made everything look normal. I accepted the job offer from Desert Crest Title Group. Quietly. Start date: 2 weeks after the board meeting. I didn't resign from my current company yet. I didn't inform Thomas. I simply secured my exit. Because power shifts the moment you're no longer dependent on the system you're about to expose. And I needed independence before impact. At the same time, Marissa filed one critical legal motion, a formal request for pre-litigation preservation. It legally required the Whitmore Holdings Trust, Thomas Keegan, and my company to retain all electronic communications related to property file 23-7719-CW, emails, text messages, server logs, financial authorizations. Once that order was filed, deleting evidence became a crime. That's when the pressure escalated again. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at my apartment unannounced. First time since he left. He looked thinner, tired, but still controlled. He stood in my doorway at 8:09 p.m., hands in his pockets, speaking softly. "Lila, this has gone too far. I didn't invite him in. What do you want?" "To settle." "Not to apologize. To settle," he continued. "My mother is willing to offer $350,000. Clean break. No court. $350,000. Higher than before." Which meant they were worried. I said nothing. He took a breath. "You don't understand what you're up against." That sentence again, always the same. Fear framed as concern. I looked at him calmly. "Then explain it." For the first time, his composure cracked slightly. "You're not just fighting me. You're fighting a partnership that controls over $28 million in property holdings." There it was. The number. Specific. Unintentional. And revealing. Because people only cite exact figures when they're scared. He continued quietly, "If this becomes public, they will destroy your career. No escrow firm will touch you." I believed that part. He wasn't bluffing. Reputation damage is real in my industry. And for a moment, I studied his face. This man I had once trusted. This man who had learned my professional systems well enough to exploit them. And I asked one question. "Did you ever love me?" The silence that followed lasted longer than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, he said something that cut cleaner than any insult. "I loved you. But you were never going to be family." Not an apology, not regret, just truth. Cold, precise, and final. That was the moment the last emotional tie broke, because I realized something important. He didn't see this as betrayal. He saw it as correction. Removing an outsider from family assets, which meant negotiation, was meaningless. There was no shared reality left. So I closed the door, gently, without another word, and I never spoke to him privately again. The next phase began immediately. Preparation. Monica, now fully cooperative under legal protection, provided something we hadn't expected. Internal meeting minutes. From a Whitmore Holdings Trust board call 6 months earlier. Recorded notes. Bullet points. Action items. One line in particular stood out. Secure Daniel's property exposure before Q4 marital risk. Marital risk. That's what they called me. Not a person, not a spouse, a risk category. And suddenly, everything aligned perfectly. The house transfer, the impersonation, the trust payment. It wasn't personal. It was strategic asset protection, which made the conspiracy easier to prove legally because it demonstrated intent, systematic, pre-planned, documented. That was the second layer of truth fully established. Proof. Not suspicion, not theory, evidence. But there was still a third layer left. The consequences, legal exposure, public collapse. And that would only happen in the right setting, which is why the board meeting mattered so much. It wasn't just a corporate event. It was an investor presentation. 37 attendees expected, including financial partners, legal advisors, and regulatory auditors. A room full of witnesses. A room they believed they controlled. That's where the final stage would unfold. 3 days before the meeting, Thomas called me into his office again. His tone was different this time, less confident. "Lila, we've decided to place you on administrative leave, pending ethics review." There it was, exactly as predicted. I nodded calmly. "When does it start?" "Immediately." He studied my face carefully, searching for panic. He didn't find any. Because administrative leave doesn't prevent attendance at shareholder meetings, and he had forgotten that detail, or assumed I didn't know. He added carefully, "It would be best if you avoided company events during this period. Advice, not a legal restriction," which meant he couldn't stop me. Not yet. And that night, I finalized the contents of the envelope I had notarized earlier. 6 documents, each representing one step of the conspiracy. The impersonation verification video transcript, the trust payment record to Monica, the internal meeting note referencing marital risk, the server audit logs showing Thomas's override authorization, the original property appraisal proving undervalued sale, and the bank wire trace linking Daniel to the transfer. Individually, they were suspicious. Together, they were undeniable. But I still hadn't decided exactly how to present them, because presentation determines impact, and impact determines outcome. As I sat there late that night reviewing everything, my phone vibrated once more. Unknown number. Same one as before. The message contained only one sentence. "You think you're prepared. You're not prepared for what happens after the truth comes out." I stared at the screen, because that wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And it made me realize something unsettling. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about what came next. Because when powerful people collapse publicly, they don't fall quietly. And I still didn't know how far they would go. Once they realized I was about to pull the entire structure down in front of an audience. 7 days before the board meeting, at 5:56 a.m., I transferred exactly $12,480 into a new legal retainer account and changed every password I had ever shared with Daniel. Not because I was afraid, because I was sealing doors. When you prepare for impact, you don't just gather evidence, you eliminate vulnerabilities. By then, administrative leave had officially begun. My access badge was deactivated, my company email locked, my name quietly removed from the internal workflow rotation. Thomas moved fast, faster than I expected, which meant he knew something was coming, or at least sensed the shift. But here's what he didn't anticipate. I didn't need internal access anymore. Everything critical had already been preserved under court notice. Server backups duplicated, video authenticated, wire confirmations certified. Monica had done her part, and she had done it carefully. She had not emailed me anything. She had not printed files from her workstation. She met Marissa in person, twice, each time at a neutral location, each time bringing only what was legally protected under whistleblower counsel. Because Monica was no longer acting out of loyalty. She was acting out of self-preservation, and that's far more reliable. If you've ever dealt with someone trapped inside corruption, you know this. They don't turn because they grow a conscience. They turn because they see the floor cracking beneath them. And Monica had finally looked down. 3 days into my leave, I received a certified letter from the company's legal department. Formal notification of internal investigation. Allegation: misuse of audit privileges for personal matters. They were building the narrative. Discredit the accuser before the accusation lands. Classic preemptive strike. I forwarded it to Marissa. Her response was immediate. Good. They're committing to a position. How is that good? I asked. Because once they formally accuse you, they lock themselves into documentation. Meaning, if we proved my audit access was compliant, their accusation would become retaliation, which opens another legal dimension: wrongful termination, whistleblower protection, corporate liability. Thomas wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was tightening a rope around his own company, and he didn't realize it. Meanwhile, Daniel stopped calling, stopped texting. Silence from his side, which meant someone had advised him to withdraw. Likely Charles Benton, the financial attorney on the trust board. I had researched him thoroughly. 22 years in asset protection law, specialized in shielding family holdings from litigation. He wasn't reckless, which meant the fact that they were escalating instead of settling told me something important. They believed I wouldn't actually go public. They believed I would blink. They believed reputation fear would win. And that belief was their final miscalculation. 5 days before the board meeting, Marissa and I met with a federal investigator, not formally filing charges yet. Just a consultation. We presented the impersonation video, the trust payment, the override logs. He didn't react dramatically. He didn't need to. He asked 3 questions. Was the impersonator paid across state lines? Yes. Did the wire transfer cross state lines? Yes. Was there coordinated electronic communication? Yes. He nodded once. This qualifies for federal review. That sentence changed the weight of everything. Because once federal interest is established, private wealth loses insulation. The investigator advised patience. Public exposure can complicate prosecution. Be strategic. Be strategic. He didn't say, don't do it. He said, be precise, which meant timing mattered even more now. And the board meeting, it wasn't just a stage. It was leverage. That night, something unexpected happened. Clara called. First time she had reached out directly. Her voice sounded different than I remembered. Less smug. More brittle. Lila, I didn't think it would go this far. You signed the LLC paperwork, I said calmly. I didn't understand all of it. You understood enough to move into my house. Silence. Then she said something revealing. Mom said it was temporary. Mom, not Daniel, not the trust. Margaret, which confirmed something I had suspected. Daniel wasn't the architect. He was the executor. Margaret and the board were the architects. Clara was a pawn with benefits, and pawns are expendable. Did you know about the impersonation? I asked. Long pause. I was told it was handled. Handled. Meaning she didn't want to know details. Willful blindness, still liability. Then she said something that caught me off guard. They're talking about making you look unstable. That wasn't new. But hearing it from her meant the conversation was active. How? I asked. I don't know specifics. Just be careful. Be careful. Strange how that phrase kept surfacing. Warnings wrapped in concern. Threats disguised as advice. After the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment. Lights off, city quiet outside. And I asked myself one question. Am I ready for the fallout? Because exposing them publicly would not simply resolve the property fraud. It would ignite corporate investigation, media possibility, professional scrutiny. It would permanently end any chance of quiet closure. But then I remembered something simple. They had already decided my silence for me. They had already erased my ownership. Already categorized me as marital risk, already tried to suspend my career, so the fallout had already begun. The only question left was who controlled it. The following morning, I received the official agenda for the board meeting. Open to partnership stakeholders. 37 confirmed attendees. Investor summary. Quarterly performance review. Asset protection updates. And at 11:45 a.m., an open floor segment for shareholder inquiries. 15 minutes. Unscripted. Public. That was the window. And in that moment, I knew exactly how it would unfold. Not a dramatic interruption. Not shouting. Not accusation. I would wait. Until the asset protection segment. And then I would ask one question, calmly, on record, about property file 23-7719-CW. Because once that question was asked publicly, they would have to respond publicly. And once they responded, the documents would follow. In that room, in front of investors, in front of auditors, in front of witnesses. Not as revenge, as evidence. But as I finalized the plan, my phone vibrated one more time. Unknown number. Different tone this time. 3 words. They know everything. And for the first time since this began, I felt the slightest flicker of uncertainty. Because if they knew everything, then what exactly were they preparing in response? On the morning of the board meeting, at exactly 11:43 a.m., I walked into the conference ballroom carrying a slim black folder that contained 6 documents and 1 decision that would end 3 careers within the next 20 minutes. There were 38 chairs arranged in a U shape. I counted them. Because counting gives you control when the room feels too quiet. At the front sat the Whitmore Holdings Partnership Board, Margaret Whitmore in a navy suit, Charles Benton reviewing a tablet, and Thomas Keegan standing near the projector screen, smiling the practiced smile of a man who believed he still owned the narrative. He noticed me immediately. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. That half-second tightening, the same one I'd seen weeks earlier. Recognition. Calculation. Alarm. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you were about to expose powerful people in a room full of investors, would you feel nervous? Or would you feel calm? Because what surprised me most in that moment was how still I felt. Not angry, not shaky, just precise. Like I was stepping into a role I had rehearsed for weeks. I sat in the back row, opened my folder, waited. The presentation proceeded exactly as expected. Quarterly performance metrics, revenue projections, portfolio expansion. And then, at 11:45 a.m., Thomas clicked to the final slide. Asset protection and risk management overview. He spoke smoothly, confidently. We have continued to maintain strong safeguards protecting partnership assets from external exposure, ensuring long-term stability for investors. The irony of that sentence almost made me smile, because he was telling the truth. They had protected their assets by committing fraud, and now they were about to explain it publicly, without realizing they were explaining their own crime. Thomas concluded. That brings us to the open inquiry segment. 15 minutes for shareholder questions. Silence filled the room. No one spoke immediately. Investors glanced at each other. Routine, predictable. And then I stood, slowly, deliberately. The sound of my chair moving echoed louder than it should have. 37 pairs of eyes shifted toward me. Thomas recognized me fully now. His voice tightened slightly. Yes, Lila Bennett, former escrow officer. Former. He said it intentionally, to frame me before I spoke. I nodded politely and asked one calm question. Can the board explain why property file 23-7719-CW was processed using an unauthorized identity verification override approved by Mr. Keegan? Silence. Immediate. Heavy. Because I hadn't accused. I had asked. And questions demand answers. Thomas froze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he recovered. I'm not familiar with that specific file. Denial. Step 1. I expected it. So I continued, calmly. That file involved the transfer of a residential property valued at $615,000 to a related party LLC at a recorded price of $410,000. Would you like me to provide the audit documentation? Murmurs began spreading across the room. Investors leaned forward. Margaret Whitmore's posture stiffened slightly. Charles Benton stopped tapping his tablet. Thomas's smile faded. Miss Bennett, he said sharply, this is not an appropriate forum. I interrupted gently. This forum includes partnership investors, regulatory auditors, and legal counsel, which makes it precisely the appropriate forum. That landed because it was true. And truth, when spoken calmly, carries weight. Thomas shifted tactics. Blame. You were placed on leave for ethical misconduct. Any claims you make must be viewed in that context. There it was. Step 2. Discredit. I nodded once. Then let's rely only on verifiable documentation. I opened the folder, removed the first document, and placed it on the front table. The certified server audit log. Clear. Timestamped. Showing Thomas's override authorization. The room went silent again. He glanced at it. His face didn't collapse. Not yet, but the color drained slightly. He tried again. That log does not indicate wrongdoing. I placed the second document, the impersonation verification transcript, with notarized authentication. Now the murmurs grew louder. Someone whispered, "Impersonation?" Charles Benton leaned forward sharply. "Where did you obtain these materials?" he demanded. I met his gaze evenly. From legally preserved audit records and federal consultation. That word changed the temperature in the room instantly. Federal. Because it implied investigation, not rumor, not internal dispute. Criminal exposure. Margaret Whitmore finally spoke, her voice controlled but cold. This appears to be a personal marital dispute. Step 3. Victim framing. Minimize. I turned toward her calmly. If it were a personal dispute, the Whitmore Holdings Trust would not have wired $75,000 to a company employee who processed the unauthorized transaction, and I placed the third document, the trust payment record. That was the moment everything broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly. Thomas's shoulders dropped. Charles Benton stopped speaking. Margaret Whitmore's hand tightened around her pen, and the investors, silent until now, began speaking all at once. What is this? Is this accurate? Was there fraud exposure? Because the narrative had flipped. They were no longer controlling the room. The room was questioning them. Denial had failed. Blame had failed. Victim framing had failed. Now came the final stage, collapse. Thomas tried once more. This is being taken out of context. I placed the final 3 documents simultaneously. The internal meeting note referencing marital risk. The bank wire trace. The property appraisal showing undervalued transfer. And then I said one sentence. Quiet. Clear. Final. This is not a misunderstanding. It is documented conspiracy to commit financial fraud. No shouting. No anger. Just truth. And truth, when supported by evidence, is devastatingly quiet. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Investors demanding explanations. Auditors requesting immediate documentation review. Legal counsel standing abruptly. Margaret Whitmore no longer spoke. She simply stared at the papers. And Thomas Keegan? He didn't argue anymore. He didn't defend. He sat down slowly and said nothing. Because silence, in that moment, was the only thing left to him. But as the chaos unfolded around the table, something unexpected happened. A man I hadn't noticed before sitting near the back stood up. He identified himself calmly. David Klein, Federal Financial Crimes Division. The room went completely still again. And in that silence, he added one final sentence. We've been monitoring this case for the past 3 weeks. My breath caught slightly. Because that meant something I hadn't known until that moment. This wasn't just exposure anymore. It was already an investigation. And suddenly I realized the collapse I had triggered, publicly, was only the beginning of consequences none of them were prepared for. At exactly 12:07 p.m., 12 minutes after I placed the final document on the table, the conference room doors were closed by 2 federal agents, and no one inside was allowed to leave. The sound of the latch clicking into place was quiet, but it carried more finality than any argument that had happened in that room. Because in that moment, the power dynamic shifted completely. This was no longer a board meeting. It was a containment scene. David Klein, the federal investigator, stepped forward, calmly, holding a thin folder of his own. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply stated facts. Based on evidence already submitted and what has been presented today, this matter involves potential federal violations, including wire fraud, conspiracy, identity impersonation in notarized transactions, and asset concealment. No dramatic language, just legal terminology. And legal terminology has a way of sounding colder than anger ever could. Margaret Whitmore spoke first. Her voice was steady, but the control in it felt brittle. This is an internal family matter. Any financial movement was lawful and documented. Denial, again. Even now. Even with agents present. David Klein didn't react emotionally. He opened his folder and removed a document. Mrs. Whitmore, we have bank authorization records showing the trust authorized payment to an impersonation contractor operating out of Nevada. That sentence landed like a physical impact because it introduced something new, something none of them expected me or anyone to have yet. Proof of the impersonator's payment trail. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Contractor, she repeated. Yes, he said calmly. The individual who posed as Mrs. Bennett during remote identity verification. He placed a photograph on the table, a clear driver's license image. Name, Rebecca Holt. Professional impersonation history tied to 3 previous real estate fraud cases. And suddenly, the last layer of truth became undeniable. This hadn't just been opportunistic fraud, it had been organized. Professional, repeated. Charles Benton spoke sharply now. This is an overreach. My clients have not been charged with anything. Deflection. Legal framing. Expected. David Klein nodded. That is correct. No charges have been filed yet. Yet. That single word shifted the room again. Because it meant consequences were pending. Not hypothetical. Real. Thomas Keegan had not spoken for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally did, His voice sounded hollow. I was following board authorization. There it was. Step 2 of collapse. Blame shifting. From denial to delegation. Margaret turned toward him sharply. You were responsible for procedural compliance. No, he replied quietly. I was told to expedite it. Silence fell again. Because the internal fracture had become visible. The alliance that once looked unified was now unraveling in real time. If you've ever watched powerful people begin to turn on each other, you know how fast loyalty disappears when consequences become personal. Clara Whitmore wasn't in the room, but Daniel was. He had arrived halfway through the meeting and stood near the back wall, pale, silent, barely breathing. When the impersonator's photo appeared, he whispered something under his breath. I couldn't hear it, but I saw his shoulders collapse. Because until that moment, he had still believed this might remain contained. A private family matter. Now it was federal evidence. And private crimes do not stay private once federal jurisdiction begins. David Klein continued calmly. We will be issuing formal requests for full financial records, communication logs, and trust authorization documents. Margaret spoke again, but this time her voice carried a different tone. Not denial, not authority, control slipping. You don't understand the consequences of making this public. He met her gaze evenly. Ma'am, the consequences were created when the fraud occurred. That was the moment the final stage arrived. Collapse. Not loud, not dramatic, just visible. Margaret leaned back in her chair and said nothing further. Thomas Keegan stared at the table, hands shaking slightly. Charles Benton closed his tablet slowly. Understanding the legal terrain had shifted beyond his ability to control it privately. And Daniel finally looked at me. Not with anger, not with accusation. With something I had never seen in his eyes before. Regret, but not the kind that seeks forgiveness. The kind that realizes consequences are irreversible. He walked toward me slowly as agents began speaking with investors and auditors around the room. His voice was barely audible. Lila, I didn't think it would end like this, I answered quietly. You didn't think it would be exposed, he swallowed. My mother said it would stay inside the family. And there it was. The core belief. The assumption that wealth and control create immunity. I held his gaze evenly. Fraud doesn't become legal just because it's done quietly. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. A few minutes later, David Klein approached me directly. His tone softened slightly. You handled this carefully. I had to. He nodded once. You should be aware. Once subpoenas begin, this will likely become public record. I already knew that. Public exposure wasn't avoidable anymore. But what surprised me was what he said next. Your documentation prevented them from moving additional assets before we intervened. Prevented, meaning they had planned more. More transfers, more concealment, more attempts to erase me financially. And suddenly, something inside me settled completely. Because this hadn't just been about recovering a house. It had stopped an entire system from continuing. That afternoon, as agents escorted board members into separate conference rooms for questioning, I walked out of the building alone. The sun outside felt strangely bright, almost quiet. No celebration. No triumph, just stillness. Because revenge, when done properly, doesn't feel explosive. It feels complete. But as I reached my car, my phone vibrated with a notification from Marissa. One line. They filed emergency motions to dissolve the trust structure, which meant something important. They weren't trying to fight anymore. They were trying to contain damage, trying to protect whatever remained. And that told me the final phase had begun. Not exposure, not collapse, aftermath. Because consequences don't end when truth comes out. They begin. And I still didn't know how far the legal fallout would reach, or how much of their empire would survive once the investigations were finished. 6 months after the board meeting, on a quiet Sunday morning in early October, I stood in front of a small white house in Scottsdale that cost $524,000 and signed my name alone on the final line of the closing documents. No co-owner, no joint account, no Whitmore. Just Lila Grace Bennett. The wire confirmation came through at 10:18 a.m. Funds received. Transaction complete. And for the first time in nearly a year, my name was attached to property that no one else could leverage, transfer, or erase. If you followed this far, You already know the exposure changed everything. But what you don't know yet is how it ended. Because collapse isn't cinematic. It's administrative. It's paperwork. It's hearings. It's quiet consequences, filed in official language. 3 weeks after the board meeting, federal subpoenas were formally issued. Thomas Keegan resigned within 48 hours. Public statement cited health reasons. 2 months later, his escrow license was suspended, pending investigation. Margaret Whitmore did not resign, at least not immediately. But when investors began withdrawing from Whitmore Holdings partnership, citing risk exposure, the structure weakened fast. The emergency motion to dissolve the trust wasn't strategic. It was defensive. And once federal investigators traced the impersonator's payment chain across state lines, the conspiracy layer solidified. Charges were not instant. They rarely are. But the financial penalties began before criminal ones did. The partnership was audited. Several properties were frozen under review. Legal fees mounted quickly. Control shifted from board members to court-appointed financial supervisors. And the most ironic part? The very system they used to protect their wealth. Forced transparency that cost them more than the House ever would have. Daniel's divorce filing was amended once investigations began. The irreconcilable differences narrative disappeared. Asset concealment became central. Marissa handled it with surgical precision. The fraudulent property transfer was voided, legally reversed. The Mesa house returned to joint status temporarily, then sold properly under court supervision. Final sale price, $628,000. Documented, transparent, and split fairly after legal offsets. Not because Daniel wanted fairness, because the court required it. Clara moved out before the official reversal. No public statement, no apology, just quiet relocation. And Monica, she cooperated fully. Her charges were reduced under whistleblower protection. She lost her position, but avoided prosecution. I don't hate her. Fear makes people do reckless things, but fear also makes people tell the truth eventually. As for Margaret Whitmore, her collapse wasn't loud, it was social. Investors distanced themselves. Industry relationships cooled. And while criminal proceedings were still pending review, the reputation damage alone fractured the image she had curated for decades. The most powerful sentence in this entire story wasn't shouted in a courtroom. It was spoken quietly by a federal investigator months earlier. Fraud doesn't become legal just because it's done quietly. That sentence echoed far longer than any accusation I made. Daniel and I finalized our divorce 5 months after the board meeting. He didn't contest, didn't fight, didn't attempt to negotiate privately again. When we signed the final documents, he looked older, smaller somehow. Not because he lost money, but because he lost narrative control. And people like Daniel don't handle loss of control well. As we stood in the courthouse hallway, he said one last thing to me. "I never thought you'd go that far," I answered calmly. "You never thought I'd refuse to stay small." That was the final conversation we ever had. And here's the part no one talks about in revenge stories. After justice comes, silence. No dramatic music, no victory parade, just ordinary mornings. I started at Desert Crest Title Group 2 weeks after the board meeting. Clean reputation, clear documentation. The federal investigation validated everything. Not a whisper of misconduct attached to my name, because I had followed every rule precisely. Preparation protects you. Anger exposes you. I chose preparation. The new house I bought isn't extravagant. It's not symbolic of revenge. It's symbolic of ownership, of boundaries, of never again placing my financial stability inside someone else's family structure. The living room faces west. In the evenings, the light hits the hardwood floors in a way that makes everything feel warm and still. Sometimes I sit there without music, without television, just quiet. Because peace, when earned, feels different than peace given. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: silence is not weakness. Stillness is not surrender. And betrayal, when documented carefully, becomes evidence, not trauma. So let me ask you one final question. If someone tried to erase you financially, would you scream or would you build a case? Because revenge doesn't have to be loud to be final. And justice doesn't require fury to be complete. I rebuilt my life without asking permission from the people who tried to dismantle it. That's the real ending, not their collapse. My clarity. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or categorized as a risk, share your thoughts below. And if you want to hear what happened to the impersonator Rebecca Holt once federal charges moved forward, that's a story for another time, because some consequences take longer to surface. And when they do, they're just as quiet.